Well, hello everyone, and thank you for attending. I'm Arlene F. Marks. I am a brain lag author with 2 books released so far from brain lag. And I would like to read from both of them if there's time. But if not, I would like to introduce you to my imaginary friends. And I have been writing for many, many years. My first published novel came out in 1990. It was a Harlequin intrigue. And since then, I've had a career as a teacher. I've had a career as an educational publisher. And now that I've retired from the classroom, I have a career as a speculative fiction author. Imaginary Friends is one of several books that Brain Lag is bringing out. There are 3 more. One in November, which is a murder mystery set on an island in Georgian Bay. And there are 2 more in 2023. And I'm currently hard at work on my 21st book. And that's if you count the 2 literacy programs and the 3 novels that are currently out of print, since, as I said, I started back in 1990. But I am the author of the Sick Transit Terra series of space opera novels. There are 6 books in that series right now. The book I'm working on currently is number 7, and there will be more to come. But let's talk about Imaginary Friends. These are short stories that I have written over the years. 3 of the ones in this collection are previously published, and the rest are original stories. And many of them were begun years ago, but only recently completed. And a couple of them take place in the worlds that I've created in my novels. And so the one that I would like to begin with, here's my age showing. The one that I would like to begin with takes place in the world of Sick Transit Terra. Rabbi Leon Goldman has been a minor character in the novels. And he's going to have a much more important role to play later on. However, I've written a short story with Rabbi Goldman as the main character. Excuse me a second. It's called Candles. The offices of the Relocation Authority in the urban district of Lakeshore, Ontario, had been purposely designed to intimidate visitors. Walls of steel, doors of glass, floors of polished marble. Rabbi Leon Goldman's heart thudded into his stomach as the elevator doors glided soundlessly apart, depositing him in a place that was cold and shiny and apparently devoid of humanity. Nothing moved or breathed in this sterile maze, including, at the moment, Leon Goldman. He was a few minutes early for an 8 o'clock appointment with his relocation officer. The tone of the summons had been disturbingly formal, even distant, coming as it did from someone he'd known since they were both 5 years old. And Goldman couldn't help imagining the worst. Leon! Goldman spun at the sound of his name and saw Josh Weinstein striding toward him, his hand outstretched for shaking. So good of you to come, as if he'd had a choice. Weinstein's forced heartiness making him even more nervous, Goldman followed the relocation officer down a long, narrow corridor to an enclosed cubicle. It was spartanly furnished, just as blank and barren as the rest of the space on this floor, with a monolithic glass door that closed and latched behind Goldman with an ominously loud click. So, Leon, how have you been? Josh asked once they were seated across the featureless expanse of desk from each other. Unsure how to respond, Goldman shrugged. How had he been? He'd been comfortable. He'd been happy. He'd been feeling secure, perhaps too secure. Josh pulled a CompuPad from somewhere behind the desktop and called up Goldman's file. You've been deferred for relocation 7 times now, correct? Goldman nodded, an icy knot beginning to form in his stomach. Weinstein leaned back in his chair with a regretful sigh. I'm afraid I can't defer you again, Leon. There's a posting available as chaplain aboard the Vasco da Gama, and you're going to have to take it. I'm sorry, but the rules have changed. Neither one of us has a choice in the matter. The Vasco da Gama, it's a ship? A star cruiser, explorer class. Weinstein leaned forward again and read aloud from the screen. It has a crew complement of 200 men and women. And how many of them are Jewish? Weinstein paused, then shook his head sadly. None of them. I hate to tell you how few practicing Jews there are out in space, Rabbi. And yet you think it's a good idea to rip me away from my congregation at Beth Abraham and transplant me onto this starship where I would be the only Jew aboard. Goldman felt the blood rush to his face and saw his anger reflected in Josh Weinstein's darkening expression. Leon, please, don't make this any more difficult for yourself. Those people are like my family. They helped me get through the loss of my wife. We have a bond. You think I don't realize that? Demanded Weinstein, now on his feet and leaning across the desktop toward him. Sarah was my friend, Leon. I miss her too. But her funeral was 4 years ago. It's time for you to put the past behind you and move on. Leon, I'm sorry, but it is what it is. You're eligible and you're going off planet. End of discussion. Weinstein sank back into his chair and busied himself with his CompuPad, refusing to make any further eye contact. Your replacement at Beth Abraham has already been selected and notified. A week from Monday, you begin 3 Earth months of orientation. That gives you plenty of time to prepare yourself for the transition. As though summoned telepathically, a woman appeared on the other side of the glass door. Miss Ellis will walk you to the elevator, said Weinstein, in a voice as cold and impersonal as the decor. And with that, the interview was over, along with a lifelong friendship. Goldman couldn't honestly say that he was surprised. The relocation authority tended to have that effect on people. By the time he stepped through the front door of his apartment, Goldman's anger had mellowed. At his age, it was important to pick his battles, and this one was clearly unwinnable. At least they were letting him stay in the clergy. That option hadn't always been offered. So he would bow out gracefully, let the congregation throw him a bon voyage party. He would be a model student at orientation. Then, if Adonai hadn't already struck him dead, he would go bravely out into the vacuum of space. Time passes. Here it is, Chaplain. You're home away from home. The young shuttle pilot who had walked Goldman from the landing bay of the Vasco da Gama to the ship's small chapel was what Sarah would have called an olive. Lieutenant Greg Ostermeyer was all of 25 years old. He was also bright, earnest, and respectful, with an air of smooth-skinned freshness that invited motherly kisses and grandmotherly pats on the cheek. Once, years ago, Leon Goldman had had a face like that. Now, however, he knew what the young officer was seeing. A man in his middle years with thinning gray hair and large pores and a slight paunch, who ought to be reclining somewhere comfortably in an easy chair, not venturing out into the hostile vastness of space. And Leon would agree with him. Orientation had prepared Goldman for the size and appearance of the multi-faith chapel. Still, as his gaze swept the interior of the tiny room, he couldn't help letting out a disappointed sigh. Artificial flowers, faux windows made of imitation stained glass, and a modest wooden cross mounted on the bulkhead behind a draped altar that held a featureless 7-branch menorah fitted with flame-shaped bulbs in place of candles. A podium sat beside the altar, looking down on just a dozen pews, 6 on each side of a narrow central aisle. Less than a quarter of the ship's crew would fit into this room. That was assuming any of them attended services at all. It was hardly what he would consider an auspicious beginning to this new chapter of his life. Abruptly, he realized that he and Ostermeyer were not alone. Someone was sitting in the rearmost pew. Curious, Goldman stepped closer and saw a woman in an officer's uniform, wearing a gauzy white scarf over a tumble of short, fiery red hair. She looked up at him and smiled, and he felt his heart turn over. Sarah's eyes had been that same shade of green. I'm sorry, he said, his tongue stumbling over the words as though he were back in high school, asking the prettiest girl in the class for a date. I didn't mean to interrupt your, what should he call it? Goldman wondered. Prayer? Worship? Meditation? Seance? Her smile never faltered. It's all right, she assured him, and he heard its warmth in her voice. I come here sometimes when I want to be alone with my thoughts. The chapel is usually empty. That was what he'd figured. Goldman nodded philosophically. After only a moment's hesitation, the woman extended her hand toward him. I'm Luce Armendaro, Stellar Cartography. I joined the crew about a standard year ago. Her grip was firm and welcoming, and Goldman had to remind himself that it was just an introductory handshake, a formality, nothing more. Lieutenant, Ostermeyer cut in, would you mind seeing that Rabbi Goldman finds his quarters? I have to get back to the landing deck. The green eyes twinkled. Sure, no problem. So, the new chaplain is Jewish? I'm afraid so, Goldman sighed, settling himself onto the pew across the aisle from her. My late husband was Jewish, Sephardic, from Hispania. I always wanted to learn more about the rituals and holidays, but we kept getting posted to different ships and somehow there was never any time. Let me know when you plan to conduct Sabbath services and I'll be sure to attend. In that moment, Leon Goldman knew he was in love. And I'm going to stop there, although the story goes on. But that gives you a taste of my imaginary friends. Now, in the two stories, the two novels that are coming out in 2023, there are 2 more characters who have their own story in this book. They are a pair, an odd couple of alien vampires. And they began as supporting players, but there was such chemistry between them that they became 2 of my favorite characters to write about. So this is the first short story that I've written featuring Maury and Shred. And it's called Maury and Shred Go Ballistic. First of all, though, I'm going to wet my whistle. This is not wine, by the way. It's cranberry juice. Just thought I'd mention that. Professor Stuart Gershrid sighed with contentment as the taxicab carried him between the stout square pillars marking the entrance to Upper Canada University. He was returning from a months-long guest lecture tour to schools on 3 continents. It felt good to be home. Gazing out the window of the cab, Gershrid saw yellow-shirted student ambassadors leading groups of prospective registrants and their parents on orientation tours of the campus. The university's president was ex-military and believed in dressing up for inspection. Now that the snow was gone, swaths of carefully groomed lawns swept away on both sides of the road, drawing the visitor's eye to the exteriors of an array of spit and polished halls of learning. The students in each faculty had put their own stamp on the occasion as well. So the entrance to the mathematics building was decorated to resemble the keypad of a huge scientific calculator. An entire outer wall of the fine arts building had been converted into a giant page of sheet music. And in front of the chemistry building sat, no, it's impossible. Stop the cab, he ordered, fumbling 3 bills out of his wallet and dropping them onto the front seat as he scrambled out of the vehicle. He couldn't have. He wouldn't dare. Moments later, gripping his briefcase with rapidly numbing fingers, Gershrid stood staring at a transparent laboratory flask at least 8 feet high that had been planted squarely in the middle of the chemistry building lawn. The mouth of the flask looked stoppered, and the vessel appeared to be filled with a swirling cloud of multicolored particles suspended in a milky solution. This statue had been roped off, with signs prominently posted all around it. Warning, do not touch. This ice sculpture is maintained at an extremely cold temperature using liquid nitrogen. Human flesh will freeze on contact. Extremely cold was an understatement. Inside the roped-off area, the ground was completely frosted over. Even outside the ropes, Gershrid could feel the air biting him right through his jacket and doing its best to rob his cheeks and forehead of sensation. Cursing under his breath, he raced into the building. His long legs took the steps 2 at a time up to the 2nd floor. Maury's office was in a far corner, flanked by classrooms. Gershrid paused just long enough to scan the appointment schedule on the wall. Then he burst through the door and exclaimed to the lone person in the room, "Please, tell me you had nothing to do with that thing outside." Dr. Malcolm DeMore looked up from the email on his computer screen and settled back in his chair with a reproachful expression on his lean, bearded face. "Welcome back, Stuart," he said with exaggerated civility. "I missed you too. How was your trip?" Gershrid batted away the question. "We had a deal, Maury. When we signed on here, we both agreed. No showing off our talents, no public displays. So what happened?" "Nothing that I intended, believe me. It was supposed to exist for just a couple of days until the judging of the ice sculptures at Winterfest. The chemistry department had no entry, and a delegation of students waited until the last minute to ask me." He shrugged. "It seemed harmless enough at the time." "Harmless? That's not what those signs are saying down there." "We had to do something to protect the public after what happened on judging day." Prompted by Gershrid's razor-eyed stare, Maury continued. "Despite being emphatically warned by a student, one of the judges insisted on touching the flask. Fortunately, she was wearing gloves, so she got to keep most of her fingers." "She's not thinking of suing." "Not anymore. The poor soul died in her sleep shortly after the mishap. It was a shame. Such a young and vibrant woman, and such polluted life essence. Ugh, it made me sick to my stomach for a day and a half." Gershrid's jaw dropped. "You drank her? I thought we'd agreed." "We agreed not to hunt where we lived or worked, and I didn't. She was a local politician with no direct connection to the university," came the patient explanation. Gershrid shook his head in disbelief. "And that thing is still standing. How can anyone not realize it's a fraud? And just how cold is light anyway?" "Ah, therein lies the rub," sighed Maury. "By itself, coherent or not, light has no temperature. But this was supposed to be an ice sculpture, and ice is cold, hence the liquid nitrogen inside the flask. So far, so good. As we both know, solid light is normally a perfect insulator. However, when natural daylight encounters a barrier, its infrared energy is transferred, becoming heat. And when said barrier is a transparent enclosure, such as my flask made of solid light, there's a greenhouse effect. The temperature of the air inside rises rapidly. Not just the air. My flask has a curved surface. It's behaving like a lens, channeling heat to the nitrogen, which in turn imprints its own temperature on the substance of the flask. The last time I checked, it sat at minus 200 degrees Celsius. It can rise another 4 degrees before the nitrogen comes to a full boil, so we've got time to figure this out. All right, so it's going to boil, Gershrid repeated. What's to figure out? Uncork the flask and release the pressure. It's not that simple. Of course it wasn't. With Maury, things never were. Gershrid sank wearily into a chair, feeling every moment of his more than 4,200 years. This is my coming home party, isn't it? Most people would decorate a room with streamers and prepare a bowl of punch laced with vodka, but not you. Where others would give gifts, you present dilemmas. The thornier, the better. Is that why you're a chemist? Because you love dropping little bombs in people's laps? Silence. As it stretched between them, a horrible suspicion took root in Gertrude's mind. All by itself, his head began to shake. It is a bomb, isn't it? He said slowly, because it's been sitting on the front lawn of this building since Winterfest in February. You see the problem? Unfortunately, the answer was yes. At this point, enough pressure had built up inside the flask to guarantee that whatever they did or didn't do, there was going to be an explosion. And that, Gertrude thought with disgust, was why he hated science. And I'm going to stop there. There's more to the story. And if you want to find out what happens with the flask, you're going to have to read the rest of the story yourself. Okay. So there is time for adventures in godhood. This book is actually a kind of sequel to an earlier book that I wrote called The Accidental God. And it came out in 2014. When I wanted to write the sequel, I reread the original book and I realized I could improve on it. And so that's what I decided to do. So this is sort of a sequel, but actually more of an expansion and revision of the original book. The basic premise, it starts out with two characters, Detective Marty Breck and a grad student named Ellie O'Toole. Ellie is at the laundromat and she thinks she sees a ghost inside a washing machine. And the ghost is talking to her. She calls 911. They send Detective Marty Breck because Marty is the one who's the butt of all the practical jokes around their particular precinct. They send Marty to take the report. And in the process, they discover that she wasn't imagining it. There's actually a multidimensional being called Demoni who likes to hang out in laundromats for reasons that are revealed later on in this book. But that's his favorite place to chill. He recommends a book. And Marty, curious, decides to read the book. And then he contacts Ellie to have a meeting with her. And so the excerpt that I'm going to read to you takes place at their meeting. And once again, cranberry juice. The on-campus coffee shop at Upper Canada University, are you seeing a theme here? Was called Lazy Susan's Bistro. It had begun life as a bookstore back in the 70s, but had reinvented itself twice. First as a refectory when the original eating place in the basement of Tudor College had been forced to close in 1998. And again after being burned to the ground by an electrical fire in 2014. Now, rebuilt and conforming completely to code, the bistro was an airy, cheerful place with patio seating, an antique wrought iron bicycle rack out front, and broadband Wi-Fi. It also served hot chocolate with assorted flavors of marshmallows, Ellie's drug of first choice. When Detective Breck had called her to request a meeting after her work shift, she'd fully expected him to invite her to the police station. Instead, he'd asked her to suggest a location near the lab, immediately piquing her curiosity, and she'd given him the bistro's address. Whether she paid for it or he did, she decided, Ellie was having chocolate today. Breck arrived while she was perusing the marshmallow list. He stepped up beside her in line and leaned in to say quietly, "There are empty tables on the patio. We can talk out there." "Okay," she replied. When she turned her head to ask whether he wanted anything to drink, he was gone. Very strange. Ellie carried her chocolate outside and sat down at the small round table he'd picked out under a green and white striped umbrella at the far end of the patio. He'd taken off his jacket, she noted, and hung it over the back of the metal chair. Evidently off duty, he'd removed his tie as well. I was going to treat you to coffee, but you disappeared before I could ask how you like it, she told him. Thanks for the offer, Ms. O'Toole, but I'm fine. And thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Now she was confused. Ellie hadn't thought she had a choice about that. And the formality of his manner made her wonder whether she could be mistaken about his being off duty as well. Leaning across the table, he lowered his voice and continued, since our encounter with Damone, I've been doing some research. I think he may be for real. About 15 years ago, the Royal Ontario Museum hosted a selection of artifacts from an archaeological dig in Spain. According to the current curators, everything they put on display had been conclusively authenticated and dated back to the early Iron Age. One of those items was a figure representing a god named Dem An Noi. You'll never guess who he was the patron deity of. Ellie paused in mid-sip and locked eyes with him. Prostitutes and concubines. I looked him up too at the university. A prof in the archaeology department told me that ancient scrolls and tablets from as far back as 700 BC mentioned Damone, or some variation of that name, as a god protector of sex workers. Breck threw her a lopsided grin. It kind of gives new meaning to the phrase trickster god, doesn't it? She groaned and shook her head. Sorry, he said, I couldn't resist. Seriously, though, as a cop, I've had to deal with prostitutes. That might explain his interest in me. Well, what's your connection? She frowned. Damone mentioned my grandfather. He used to be a Superior Court judge before he retired. Not many prostitution cases are heard that high up, Breck remarked. Then I haven't got a clue. Well, Damone gave me one when he suggested I read a book by Claire Amory. I looked her up in Cyberpedia, apparently using the pen name Darien D'Amore. She's churned out about 24 paranormal romances, but her debut novel in 2005 was a fantasy written under her own name. I picked up a copy of it in a secondhand bookstore a few days ago and finished reading it last night. He reached down, pulled a paperback from his inner jacket pocket, and placed the book on the table between them. Ellie cocked her head and read the title aloud. 3 Heads Are Better. What's it about? 3 people who are strangers to each other go to sleep one night, and when they wake up, they're in one another's bodies, thanks to a playful deity named, she gasped her next breath. Damone? She actually calls him that in the book. She does. She's given the human characters fictitious names, but I'm pretty sure the young woman is based on Claire herself. You need to read this book, Breck advised her, and then we need to speak with its author.
Hi.
I'm going to stop there. So these books are available either from the publisher, Brainlag, or from Amazon. And my personal recommendation, if you go through amazon.ca and you're in Canada, the shipping is free. So there you go. Are there any questions? Trickster God, big chuckle. Does anyone have any questions or comments?
No, I think we're all good. Thank you very much, Arlene. It was a pleasure hearing you read.
Well, you're very welcome. I enjoy reading, actually. So.
Thanks.
And
I was there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if I can just put in a plug for my next book coming up, maybe. Have I got a minute?
Yes, you have.
Okay. It is a murder mystery with paranormal elements that takes place on an island in Georgian Bay. And one of the main characters is a firefighter who hates murder mysteries. So to find himself in the middle of one, he finds very unpleasant. However, it turns personal when an actual murder occurs and fingers start pointing at him. And that's all I'm going to say about that book. But the title is Weekends Can Be Murder, and it will be coming out from Brainland.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of the
Bye,
day.
thank
Yeah.
you.
I'm shutting it down.
Okay.